you're going to find a whole bunch of tropes. And there are whole websites out there like TV tropes that point these tropes out. And my favorite one that I used in this blog was one called The Sorting Algorithm of Evil.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the IBM Expert Chat for AT&T series, where we discuss new technology trends and topics with key industry experts. Today's guest, I'm happy to have Kyle Brown. Kyle Brown is an IBM Fellow. That's the top technical rank you can have in IBM. And he is also the CTO for IBM's Cloud Architecture. Kyle, welcome.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to be here.
And it's great to have you. I know you spent most of your career in software development and architecture, and recently this book has come up, and I'm trying to figure out, for some of us that have been around a while, we recognize this book, but probably not everybody does. So, what is this book, first of all?
So, the book that you're holding is by Gamma Helms, Johnson, and Blasides, and it's called Design Patterns: Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. And what happened is, earlier this year, there was this little Twitter war that broke out. And it broke out because it's the 25th anniversary of the release of this book in 2020. The book originally came out in 1995. And there were a few posts here and there of people just tweeting, oh, yeah, it's the 25th anniversary of Design Patterns. That's cool. And it created this unprecedented just tweet storm of people who, and this is showing our age in this a little bit, Jason, people who had been forced to read this book in college, coming back with things like, the book is impenetrable. I couldn't understand any of it. And in the absolute best one, someone called it the Atlas Shrugged of computer science.
Oh my.
So, I just wasn't prepared for the vituperativeness and just the rancor about this book. And so that's what prompted me to, in the end, write a blog post kind of responding to some of this, pain that people were feeling about their feelings about this book.
Yeah, it seems like, like you said, for those of us that sort of grew up with it, this is how we did object-oriented design and all of that. So why this much later, do you think it's caused an issue? And what was the summary, I guess, of your really awesome Medium blog post?
Well, so what I did is I actually took a step back even farther in time than when this book came out. Because what I had to do was help people realize that this book came out of a culture, and that there were a lot of parts of that culture that weren't communicated just by reading the book. And if you're trying to read the book in isolation, you're going to miss a lot of the important parts of the culture that it's trying to communicate. And what I did is I stepped all the way back to the way that I originally learned how to program when I was in high school. But really what I focused in on was what was the most formative and important part of my programming education. And that actually wasn't in high school or college or even in graduate school. It was when I was learning Smalltalk at a little company called Knowledge Systems Corporation. And Smalltalk really influenced, I'm going to say, a huge swath of the most influential architects and developers and authors that really are behind a lot of the most important ideas that we have now in computer science. Just to give you one early indication of this, we're all familiar with the Agile Manifesto, right? And everyone, is kind of familiar with Agile development and what that is. And people throw about terms from Scrum and from extreme programming and things like that. That's all like common knowledge in the industry now, right? What most people don't realize is that of the, 17, 18 people that were at the Snowbird conference and signed the Agile Manifesto, something like 14 of them were Smalltalk developers.
Wow, I feel left out that I didn't learn Smalltalk.
Yeah, and that's one part of it. A lot of us that were part of that culture back in the day, we end up saying, well, Agile's just the way we learn to do Smalltalk. But there was a really important thing that was also part of the small talk culture that I think is at the heart of why people feel so badly about this book. And that is, you have to realize something about the way small talk worked. Small talk was really unusual, even for its time, in that all of the source code was there as part of the image for you to read. And in fact, that's the way people really learn to write code in Smalltalk. They learn to write code by reading the source code that was already there for the entire Smalltalk system. I mean, everything in Smalltalk, even the compiler, was actually written in Smalltalk. And you could go and browse through the compiler classes or the UI classes for the browsers or the editors and all the rest of that. You could find out how it all worked. And that influenced the way that you ended up developing because you were essentially learning to work through reading examples, which is very different than the way I was taught to program. Because when I was taught to program in college, we were all taught, well, you have your professor up there talking about some idea like semaphores, and they give you some pseudocode, and then they say, okay, it's your job to go translate that pseudocode into whatever language you're using in that class.
Right.
And every class I had was like that. It's like, they give you an idea and you have to figure out how to write it and how to implement it. But this is very different than this idea of I'm going to go and I'm going to read 10, 15, 20 examples of something that's not quite what I want to do, but it's kind of similar to what I want to do. And the analogy that I drew to this is it's a literary analogy. One of the things you can tell just from my background, I do a lot of reading. But one of the things that is kind of important about this literary analogy is this idea that if you read a whole bunch of books or novels or short stories in a particular genre, like detective stories or science fiction or romance novels, whatever genre you imagine, you're going to find a whole bunch of tropes. And there are whole websites out there like TV tropes that point these tropes out. And my favorite one that I used in this blog was one called The Sorting Algorithm of Evil. All right.
Okay.
If you ever played a video game that's a like fantasy video game or, even a lot more of the action-oriented first-person shooters, you realize that there's this common pattern that happens in that what happens is you meet the low-level monsters first, and you have to deal with them. Then you solve some puzzles, and then you meet the next hardest monster, the next higher level, and you have to deal with them. And this keeps going on until finally you get to what is called the big boss fight. And the big boss fight is always at the end of the game, just before you finish the game. Well, if you start thinking about a lot of TV shows that are from that era, and one of the favorite ones I use for this is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I loved those kind of 90s WB shows like Buffy, okay? But if you're familiar with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it would be the same thing. Every episode, Buffy and her crew would have to deal with some sort of low-level monster, and then toward the end of the episode, there would be the big boss fight, okay? That's the sorting algorithm of evil. You always have the lower-level monsters first, and then the higher-level monsters at the end, because it's building up to that. Well, if you just think about that as a trope, you'll realize, okay, wait a minute, that trope goes beyond fantasy television and video games. That kind of shows up everywhere. Well, it's the same thing about learning to find tropes in your code. But the thing is, you have to read lots of code to be able to identify those. And that was one of these things from the Smalltalk culture that didn't make it into, I'm going to call it the wider object-oriented and Java culture, is this whole notion of doing lots of reading before you start writing, because when you do it the other way, you're not going to be exposed to that same set of tropes, and you're not going to recognize them as easily when you see them.
So does that mean, in this book then is they captured those tropes or patterns down for everybody to learn, but maybe if you didn't come from that background, you don't appreciate that as much?
Exactly. And that's the thing, is what they captured 23 tropes. Now, these are 23 tropes that when I first encountered the book and actually read through the book, I recognized almost all of them because I had done so much reading. But I mean, if I'd come from a different culture, like what is now the predominant Java culture, to where you do an awful lot more writing than you do reading, I would never have come across these, and they wouldn't have been as easy for me to identify. And that's part of what makes the whole question difficult. And that's why the subtitle of my article was Rediscovering the Lost Art of Reading Code, because I think we have lots of opportunities to do that now, especially with the explosion of open source projects. But it's not something that we necessarily take advantage of to the extent that we could.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. I mean, with GitHub and open source stuff, it would seem there's no shortage of code that you can go out there and read and figure out, well, how did they solve this problem? And,
It
what
is.
is the pattern behind that?
And that's the thing I'd encourage. For so many of us, when we're consuming an open source project, the way we consume it is we go and we read the markdown that basically gives you the examples of how to call the APIs. And maybe if you have to, if you ever run into a bug, you might read just the one piece of code that corresponds to that API. Well, what I'm going to suggest is something entirely different, which is treat it like a genre of literature. Just actually read the whole thing. The great thing about GitHub and tools like that is they're great for browsing and being able to just kind of go through and figure out how people wrote these things. And then as you do that through several projects, you can start to think about, well, wait a minute, what are those things that I've seen more than once? And how can I
So
apply that idea?
I can imagine a lot of developers are saying, "Oh, great, but I don't have time to read. I got to crank out the code." Do you see that if you do enough of this reading, that ultimately it makes you a better programmer, better developer in the end, and then you will be more efficient, possibly.
It totally does. And it's very similar to the same kind of arguments I hear about pair programming. A lot of people have, without trying pair programming, say, well, it obviously can't be as efficient for two people to be working together on one set of code than it is for the two people to work separately. But over the years, there have been lots of studies, many of them done by Lori Williams at NC State, but there are several other academic researchers that have done this too, that have shown it's quite the opposite. That what happens is your productivity goes up as you're working with someone else because you're swapping ideas back and forth, and really putting two pairs of eyes together on the same problem can result not only in better solutions, but solutions that come out faster because you don't sit around thinking about, well, what do I do next? Well, the cool thing is reading lots of code is like that. It's like you get to pair program with all the best developers in the world because you're sitting there and you're reading and learning from what they've already done. And you just have to be able to then figure out how you can take what you're learning from that and apply it to what you're doing.
Very cool. Hey, any other analogies you draw, I guess, from those early days of design patterns and object-oriented programming to other problems we might be encountering as we're building systems today?
Absolutely. The one thing you want to think about, and this is one of the things I talk about in the blog really quickly, is these were not the only 23 patterns that there are. These are just 23 tropes. Again, it's describing one particular subgenre of coding as literature. But if you look at other genres, there's lots of other patterns that are just as important. For instance, microservices design. There have been a bunch of great books on microservices design written as patterns. I've got a couple of them here on my bookshelf right now. The one from the guys at Container Solutions on cloud native design is absolutely fantastic. Chris Richardson's book on patterns of microservices is also a terrific book if that's the genre you're working within. But as we expand into other genres, there are new patterns that are emerging. I just read a plot paper, plot being the Pattern Languages Programs Conference, which is another thing you can look at on the web if you want to do some reading, on patterns of machine learning and AI. And it's one of these things to where I love this paper because until I read the paper, I had been doing a lot of these things, but I hadn't thought of them as patterns. And these are really simple, straightforward things like you need different environments for training your ML model and running your ML model. because, the amount of data you process on this side is way harder and way bigger than the amount of data you process on this side. And it's like, if you've ever done any machine learning, you know that. But I wouldn't have thought to explain that to someone if I was teaching them about ML in the first instance. So that's the benefit. You just got to look for the tropes. And when you see them, write them down and share them with other people. And that's how the patterns community gets going.
That's awesome. Hey, Kyle, is great talking to you once again. You're always full of insight and everything. I'll put a few links to the books and the sites that you mentioned into the show notes. But thanks so much for joining us on this expert chat.
Thanks, Jason. Take care.
Take care.